Welcome to Dr. Osborne's Zone. We're doing a deep dive today into the freest and most powerful form of medicine available to each and every one of you. And that medicine is sunshine, the most powerful medicine on earth. Now, we talk about sunshine, we talk about light, and there are different spectrums of the light field, but we go from ultraviolet to infrared. Ultraviolet and infrared are wavelengths that you don't necessarily see. They're beyond the visual spectrum, but they have tremendous amounts of impacts physiologically on our bodies, and we're going to dive into that today. Now, one of the things that I think it's important to start this conversation off with is the rhetoric that's been going around. It's really not even rhetoric. This is most of mainstream medicine, the field of dermatology. The standard of care and the standard of advice is stay out of the sun, lather up in sunscreen to prevent skin cancer. So I want to have this part of the conversation first to give you preface on why that advice is probably not great advice, it's probably actually terrible advice, and why. So let's dive into some of the more recent reviews and research papers posing this very same question. So you can see this was published in Dermatoendocrinology, and public health authorities in the United States are recommending that men, women, and children reduce their exposure to sunlight based on concerns that this exposure will promote skin cancer. On the other hand, data show that increasing numbers of Americans suffer from vitamin D deficiencies and serious health problems caused by insufficient sun exposure. The body of science concerning the benefits of moderate sun exposure is growing rapidly and is causing a different perception of sun UV as it relates to human health. Melanoma and its relationship to sun exposure and sunburn, I want to point this out and circle it for you, is not adequately addressed in most of the scientific literature. And this is what are we being told? We're being told that sunshine causes skin cancer. Is not adequately addressed in most of the scientific literature. Reports of favorable health outcomes related to adequate serum 25-OHD, which is vitamin D, concentration or vitamin D supplementation, have been inappropriately merged so that benefits of sun exposure other than production of vitamin D are not adequately described. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the non-vitamin D benefits of sun exposure as well. Again, this review considers the studies that have shown a wide range of health benefits from sun/UV exposure. These benefits include, among others, various types of cancer, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease and dementia, myopia and macular degeneration, diabetes, and multiple sclerosis. And this, I want to point out, this review was done in 2016. So this is not even new information. So going back, to 2016, one of the bigger concerns is the general advice of mainstream medicine, which is to avoid the sun for fear of cancer. But what you're actually doing is, for fear of cancer, you're trading all these other potential benefits of sunshine, and you're throwing those out the window for a fear that hasn't been really proven in the medical literature definitively. So let's come to this more recent review. Insufficient sun exposure has become a real public health problem. This published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. This article aims to alert the medical community and public health authorities to accumulating evidence on health benefits from sun exposure, which suggests that insufficient sun exposure is a significant public health problem. Significant health problem. How significant is it? Studies in the past decade indicate that insufficient sun exposure may be responsible for 340,000 deaths, and this is just in the United States, and 480,000 deaths in Europe. So let's do a little bit of math. That's 820,000 total deaths in the US and Europe alone. And an increased incidence of breast cancer, colorectal cancer, high blood pressure, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's disease, autism, asthma, type 1 diabetes, and myopia. Collectively, this evidence indicates it would be wise for people living outside the tropics to ensure they expose their skin sufficiently to the sun. So again, I know a lot of you have a fear. It's been ingrained into you from from the last many decades of misinformation that has been pushed down our throats, both in mainstream medicine but also in public health. So let's talk about a few other research studies to drive this point home. This one was a major study on women in Sweden, and here's what they found. 29,518 Swedish women in a prospective 20-year follow-up study of melanoma in southern Sweden. They call it the MISS study. Here was the conclusion. The results of this study provide observational evidence that avoiding sun exposure is a risk factor for all-cause mortality. In other words, a risk factor for dying. Following sun exposure advice that is very restrictive in countries with low solar intensity might in fact be harmful to women's health. Now, I think the takeaway here is, you know, if you're maybe living near the equator or on the equator, this advice may not apply to you 100%, but at the end of the day, you need sun exposure. And avoiding sun exposure, especially those of you who live in northern climates where there's less sun availability anyway, there's an potential increased risk or an association increased risk of all-cause mortality. Again, not a fair trade. And then we look at this systematic review and meta-analysis of just being outside, green space exposure on health outcomes. And so in this meta-analysis, results showed increased green space exposure was associated with depressed salivary cortisol. So cortisol is the stress hormone. So basically green space exposure reduces your stress hormone production, but also heart rate, diastolic blood pressure, as well, your heart rate variability, increased high frequency and low frequency heart rate variability, but also decreased risk of preterm births, type 2 diabetes, all-cause mortality, small size for gestational age births, as well as cardiovascular mortality, and an increased incidence of good self-reported health. So this review, a lot of different conditions found to be benefited as a result of being outside in green spaces. In their conclusion, green space exposure is associated with numerous health benefits, and intervention and observational studies. These results are indicative of beneficial influence on green space on a wide range of health outcomes. So again, more evidence and reasons to not hide in your house all the time, right? And then we look at this study published a couple years ago in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. And you can see just conclusions here. Bright sunlight, but not outdoor temperature, might be associated with increased insulin sensitivity and lower triglyceride levels. Again, this was just simply being exposed to bright sunlight. It didn't matter what the temperature outside was. It didn't have to be, it could be winter, it could be summer. Temperature didn't matter, but the brightness of the sunlight, again, increased insulin sensitivity and lower triglyceride levels. So found that specifically outdoor sunlight showed beneficial associations with insulin resistance. Now, how many of you watching this are diabetic? How many of you watching this are overweight? How many of you watching this are pre-diabetic? Sunshine, very, very powerful medicine. Now, as we said before, the standard care of advice has traditionally been avoid the sun. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the sunscreen market, and most sunscreen companies, or many of them, are actually owned by the same companies that own pharmaceuticals. But you can see this is a $13 billion a year market. That's just sunscreen. We're not talking about the $3.2 trillion medical market to treat sick people. And this is just in the U.S. $3.2 trillion annually in the U.S. For medical care to treat chronic illness. And again, what I just showed you is that sunshine exposure is linked to reduced risk of all-cause death, cardiovascular disease, multiple forms of autoimmune disease, insulin resistance, blood sugar regulation. The list goes on, and we'll keep talking about it. Now, again, that's mainstream medical advice. It's to avoid the sun and lather up with sunscreen, but very rarely do you hear a doctor talk about nutritional protection against the potential for sunlight damage with diet. with micronutrients. And so in this particular review, you can see here micronutrients can act as UV absorbers, as antioxidants, or can modulate signaling pathways elicited upon UV exposure. UV-induced erythema, that's sunburn, is a sustainable, or rather a suitable parameter to assess photoprotection. Dietary protection is provided by carotenoids. Carotenoids are plant-based substances found in things like carrots and other, red, yellow, and orange colored vegetables and fruits. Tocopherols, which are vitamin E family, and ascorbate, which is vitamin C, as well as flavonoids. And flavonoids are the chemical compounds found in numerous types of foods. You get flavonoids in green tea, you can get flavonoids in apples, etc. Or omega-3 fatty acids, contributing to maintenance resistance as part of lifelong protection. In other words, what this review is summarizing is that there are nutrients that you obtain from your food that have UV and photoprotective impacts and effects. And so if your diet is clean and you have a good diet and it's rich and abundant and healthy food, you actually can protect yourself from sunlight, from potential for sunlight damage from sunburning. Again, the key here is that sunburning, because you don't need to protect yourself from the sun, you just need to be sensible about your length of exposure.